I'll let you read first.
Okay.
You did a good job in New York in reading first.
Okay. The prologue is titled The Last Days of the Red Rain. The clank and rattle of what he thought of as the system had long since faded into mere background noise to Gus. Or maybe he was just going deaf. He was certainly old enough, beyond old enough for it. In any event, it didn't matter. He was the only one tending to the system, so he was the only one to talk to, and he'd gotten bored with himself a long, long time ago. Stooped and twisted with age, nearly 50 years if he remembered correctly, and almost unheard of longevity, he limped around the chamber with only himself for company. The system was a series of belts, tubes, pulleys, and wheels arranged in a circuitous route through a large chamber. It began at an inclined chute at one end and wended its clacking, whirring way through the chamber to the opposite end. The system was all about bodies. Tall, short, thin, fat, young, old, frail, robust, every color and shade decreed by nature or by God, take your pick. The bodies wound through the system day and night, hauled along as machines, snapped and plucked at them, stripping them of clothing, jewelry, and all the other accoutrement of the living world. They entered the system as they died. They left it as they'd been born, naked and alone. Gus monitored the system. He attended to its needs. Though he had his suspicions, he didn't know where the bodies came from or where they went. Long ago, he'd decided that it was best simply to be grateful he wasn't one of them. This day a sound came to him, pitched high above the muted rumble of the machinery. At first he thought it had to be his imagination. Then he thought it must be his ears finally giving up the ghost after so many years of abuse. But the sound persisted, high-pitched and abjectly terrified and definitely alive, not mechanical. He peered around the chamber, seeking the source of the sound. In the echoing confines of the system, it was difficult to pinpoint a specific noise. Standing still, he listened intently. Paused, willing the sound to become louder. Miraculously, it did. It rose to a blood-curdling howl. Gus rushed to the tunnel that opened up into the system. The noise had come from there. He knew it. He gaped at what he saw. Gus had worked the system as long as he could remember, most of his life, really, decades. He'd never tried to count the bodies that came through, and even if he had, he would have given up on tallying them long ago. But this, he knew, was the first time he'd ever seen a living one. A baby. A tiny, defenseless baby lay on a series of grinding cylinders that bore the bodies into the system. She, for she was naked, squawked and squalled, waving one pudgy fist in terrified indignation, kicking her chubby legs. She was stuck. As she'd slid down the chute, her left shoulder had been caught in the gears of the machinery. It pinched there, purple going black, and she howled. Sometimes bodies got stuck like this. Gus had tools to break them loose, but such tools were for dead bodies, not living ones, and he froze for an instant, unsure what to do. She cried out again, her face going purple now.
There was no time to hit the emergency shutdown switch. She would be ripped to shreds before then. And besides, hitting the switch would mean questions, and Gus understood that it was best not to have questions when he had no answers. Wincing in sympathetic pain, he tugged at her, gently at first, and then, finally, with all his strength, when gently didn't suffice. With a yowl of pain, she became free from the machine, leaving behind an inch-wide strip of flesh from high up on her neck to her shoulder. Bright red blood spilled, and Gus nearly lost his grip on her as it flowed down to his hands, making her slippery. Shush, shush, she cooed, almost by instinct. A baby. When was the last time he'd seen a baby? A living baby, he amended. Hush, hush, he tried. And still she wailed. He couldn't blame her. He knew what he should do. He knew his job. Bodies came into the system, and bodies went through the system, and bodies left the system. His job was to make sure everything ran smoothly. And while he'd always assumed the bodies would be dead, and had always seen only dead bodies, no one had ever specifically died. He should put her on the rolling cylinders and let her leave the system as everyone else did, to go wherever they went. She screamed and whimpered, and her blood spilled. Gus chewed at his bottom lip. It had been so long since he cried that he didn't even realize he was doing it until the first fat tears splashed on her round little belly. Hush, hush, he whispered, bouncing her lightly. Hush, hush. That ain't gonna heal on its own. Sorry, no. But I think old Gus can do what he can do. He carried her to his workbench and swept his tools aside. The bench was dirty and scarred with age, but better than whatever lay beyond the system. He set her down and began rummaging in his toolbox, muttering to himself, fishing line, fishing line. He hadn't fished since he was a boy, and even the rivers then had been dead. But the line came in handy for a number of tasks, so he always kept a supply. He dug it out now and then found a needle from the kit he used to repair his clothes. This ain't gonna feel so good right now, he warned her, threading the needle with a fine light filament, but it'll feel better later, I promise. He took a deep breath. He held her down and began to sew.
This is an audiobook that that guy read. Yeah, specified.
I keep saying specific. That's why I didn't read.